Arlington Military Hospital, Washington, D.C. A young female doctor in a crisp white coat, hair pulled back in a neat bun, prepares for emergency surgery on a critical patient, a four-star general. Three older doctors stand behind her, laughing quietly. She's barely in her 20s. Letting her operate is a joke, right? She doesn't respond, just pulls on her surgical gloves and says calmly, "I don't need anyone to believe in me. I just need the patient to live." 2 hours later, the man on the operating table opens his eyes. He looks at her stunned, then whispers, "Commander, I thought you were killed in action." The entire operating room falls silent. Dr. Emily Carter was 29 years old when she transferred to Arlington Military Hospital, making her the youngest neurosurgeon on staff by nearly a decade. She had spent the previous 6 years serving in Navy field medical operations, rotating through combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, performing surgeries in conditions that would have broken most civilian doctors. But nobody at Arlington knew about that background because Emily didn't talk about her past, and her youthful appearance made it easy for people to dismiss her as inexperienced. The hospital staff would whisper whenever she walked through the corridors, "Is she even old enough to be a surgeon? She looks like she just graduated medical school." Others were less subtle in their skepticism. "I heard she transferred from some naval program, but come on, she can't be more than 25. How much experience could she possibly have?" Emily had learned to ignore the comments and the condescending looks. She focused on her work with an intensity that sometimes made her colleagues uncomfortable. She arrived early, stayed late, and took on cases that other doctors considered too routine or too difficult. Her approach was methodical and calm, never rushing, but never hesitating either, moving through surgical procedures with a confidence that came from having performed similar operations under much worse conditions. The head of neurosurgery was Dr. Lawrence Harlan, a man in his late 50s who had built a reputation as one of the top surgeons on the East Coast. He was skilled, experienced, and also deeply skeptical of anyone who hadn't put in the same decades of service that he had. He made it clear from Emily's first day that he considered her a liability rather than an asset. During department meetings, Harlan would cut her off whenever she tried to contribute to case discussions. "Dr. Carter, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but perhaps you should focus on learning our procedures before you start suggesting alternatives to established protocols." The message was clear. Stay in your lane, follow orders, and don't try to prove yourself until you've earned the right. Emily never argued, never pushed back publicly. She would simply nod and say, "I understand, Dr. Harlan. I'm here to learn and to help patients in whatever capacity you need." But privately, she kept a small notebook where she documented cases and observations, detailed records that showed patterns and possibilities that the senior staff was missing because they were too set in their ways to see them. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when the emergency department received a call that sent shockwaves through the entire hospital. A military transport plane carrying General Samuel Briggs had crashed during a training exercise just outside the city. The general, a highly decorated officer who had commanded air operations during the Battle of Fallujah and served in every major conflict over the past 3 decades, had sustained massive head trauma and multiple fractures. His survival was uncertain, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly during transport. The hospital mobilized its entire senior surgical team, but as the details of the general's injuries became clear, something unprecedented happened. One by one, the senior surgeons examined the scans and test results, and one by one, they declined to take the case. The injuries were too severe, the probability of success too low, and the political consequences of failure too high. 8 experienced neurosurgeons looked at the general's file and said the same thing. This patient cannot be saved, and attempting surgery would be a waste of resources. Emily was in the staff lounge reviewing patient charts when she overheard the conversation. Harlan was explaining to the hospital administrator why surgery was impossible. "The cranial damage is too extensive. The bleeding is too widespread. Even if we could stabilize him during surgery, which is doubtful, the likelihood of meaningful recovery is less than 1%. I'm sorry, but sometimes we have to accept reality. Emily stood up from her chair and spoke clearly. I'll do it. The room went silent. Harlan turned to stare at her with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. Excuse me? Dr. Carter, do you have any idea who this patient is? Do you understand the complexity of what you're suggesting? This isn't a training exercise. This is a 4-star general whose death on our operating table would have national implications. Emily met his gaze without flinching. I understand exactly who he is and what's at stake. I've performed cranial repairs in field hospitals with limited equipment and no backup. I've operated in tents during artillery bombardments. I've kept patients alive when everyone said it was impossible. At least here, I'll have proper lighting and functioning equipment. Harlan's face reddened, but before he could respond, the hospital administrator interrupted. Dr. Carter, if you're willing to take responsibility for this surgery, you have authorization. But understand that the consequences of failure will be entirely yours. Emily nodded once. I accept those terms. As she walked toward the surgical preparation area, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of faded fabric, a fragment of a Navy medical operations patch that she had kept with her since leaving active duty. She kissed it gently, a ritual she had performed before every difficult surgery during her combat service, and whispered words that only she could hear. Give me one more chance to save a life. Operating Room 6 was a state-of-the-art surgical suite equipped with the latest imaging technology, robotic assistance systems, and monitoring equipment that could track dozens of vital signs simultaneously. But all that advanced technology meant nothing if the surgeon operating the equipment didn't have the skill and nerve to use it effectively. Emily stood at the scrub station, methodically washing her hands and forearms, her movements precise and ritualistic, preparing both physically and mentally for what was about to happen. The nursing staff assigned to the surgery exchanged nervous glances as they prepared the operating theater. One of the younger nurses whispered to her colleague, "Is she really only 29? She's about to operate on a 4-star general. What if something goes wrong?" The other nurse shrugged helplessly. 8 senior surgeons said this was impossible. If she fails, at least nobody can say she didn't try. Dr. Harlan had positioned himself in the observation gallery above the operating room, along with several other senior physicians who had come to watch what they expected to be a disaster. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of concern and skepticism. She's going to realize within the first 30 minutes that this is beyond her capabilities. I give her credit for courage, but courage doesn't keep patients alive. Emily entered the operating room and approached the table where General Briggs lay unconscious, his head partially shaved and marked with surgical guidelines. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder for just a moment, a gesture that surprised the nursing staff. Then she took her position, checked the positioning of every instrument and every piece of equipment, and gave the signal to begin. The initial incision revealed the extent of the damage immediately. Blood vessels had ruptured throughout the cranial cavity, creating widespread bleeding that obscured visibility and made it nearly impossible to identify which structures were damaged and which were still intact. One of the assisting nurses saw the amount of blood and gasped audibly. "Dr. Carter, there's too much bleeding. We can't even see what we're working with." Emily's voice was calm and steady, showing none of the tension that everyone else in the room was feeling. "I can see enough. Suction here, clamp there, and increase the lighting by 20%. Her hands moved with extraordinary precision, working in small, controlled movements that gradually brought order to the chaos inside the general's skull. 40 minutes into the surgery, the cardiac monitor showed a concerning pattern. The general's heart rate was dropping, his blood pressure was falling, and several of the nurses exchanged worried looks. Harlan leaned forward in the observation gallery, convinced that the surgery was about to fail. "She's losing him. I knew this would happen." But Emily had seen this pattern before, in a field hospital outside Ramadi when she had been operating on a soldier with similar injuries. She knew that the declining vitals weren't necessarily a sign of imminent death, but rather a physiological response to the trauma and the anesthesia. She made a decision that shocked everyone watching. "Prepare the defibrillator. I need 2 electrode pads ready, and nobody panic." The general's heart rhythm became increasingly irregular, the monitors showing a pattern that was dangerously close to cardiac arrest. Emily continued working on the cranial repair even as she monitored the cardiac situation, her focus absolute. When the heart finally stopped beating altogether, the alarm system screamed their warnings, and several people in the operating room froze, uncertain what to do. Emily didn't freeze. She'd been in this situation dozens of times in combat zones, and she knew exactly what needed to happen. She placed her hands directly on the general's chest and began manual cardiac compression, counting out loud to maintain the correct rhythm. 3, 2, 1, clear. She applied the defibrillator. Nothing. Again, 3, 2, 1, clear. The second shock produced a weak but detectable heartbeat. "That's it. Come on, General. You're not finished yet." The heart rate climbed slowly but steadily, 20 beats per minute, then 30, then 45. The monitors showed improving vital signs across the board. Emily returned to the cranial surgery, working for another 90 minutes to repair damaged blood vessels, remove bone fragments, and reconstruct the protective membranes around the brain tissue. Every movement was deliberate, every decision was calculated, and every stitch was placed with the kind of precision that only comes from having performed similar procedures under impossible conditions. When the surgery finally concluded, the clock showed 4 hours and 11 minutes had elapsed. Emily stepped back from the operating table, her surgical gown soaked with sweat despite the cool temperature of the operating room. She looked at the monitors showing stable vital signs and allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. The lead nurse came over and spoke quietly. "Dr. Carter, I've been working in surgical units for 20 years. I've never seen anything like what you just did." Harlan came down from the observation gallery, his expression completely transformed from skepticism to something approaching awe. He approached Emily and spoke in a voice that everyone in the room could hear. "Dr. Carter, you just saved a 4-star general when 8 senior surgeons, including myself, said it was medically impossible. How did you know you could do this?" Emily pulled off her surgical gloves and looked at him with tired but clear eyes. "I didn't save a general, Dr. Harlan. I saved a soldier. That's all I've ever tried to do." She walked to the scrub station to wash up, and as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she could see a small spot of blood on her collar. In her pocket, the Navy Medical Operations patch was still there, a reminder of all the soldiers she had saved and all the ones she couldn't. 2 days after the surgery that everyone said was impossible, General Samuel Briggs opened his eyes in the intensive care unit. He had been unconscious since the moment of the crash, his brain slowly recovering from the trauma and the extensive surgical repair. The nursing staff immediately notified Dr. Carter, who was in the middle of reviewing charts for other patients. She dropped everything and rushed to the ICU, not because protocol required it, but because she genuinely cared about every patient she operated on. When Emily entered the room, the general was sitting partially upright, looking confused but alert. His eyes focused on her as she approached the bed, and for a long moment, he simply stared at her face as if trying to remember something important. Then his expression changed dramatically, shifting from confusion to recognition to complete astonishment. "Dr. Carter? Emily Carter?" Emily checked his vital signs on the monitoring equipment, pleased to see that everything looked stable and improving. "Yes, General Briggs. I'm the surgeon who operated on you. How are you feeling? Any pain, disorientation, or visual problems?" She was being professional, following standard post-operative assessment procedures, but the general wasn't interested in routine medical questions. "Your Commander Carter, Navy Medical Operations, Bravo Unit, Ramadi, 2017. His voice was hoarse but absolutely certain. "You were the field hospital commander who saved my nephew's entire squad when they were ambushed in the city center. You performed surgery in a bunker while the building was under direct fire." The room, which had contained several nurses and a resident physician, went completely silent. Everyone turned to stare at Emily, whose face showed genuine surprise. She hadn't expected anyone at Arlington to know about her military service, and she certainly hadn't expected a patient to recognize her. "General, you should rest. We can talk about the past after you've recovered more fully." But General Briggs was not willing to let the moment pass. He reached out and took Emily's hand, his grip weak but determined. "No, Commander, I need to say this now. My nephew, Lieutenant Michael Briggs, would be dead if you hadn't refused to evacuate when you were ordered to. You stayed in that field hospital for 3 days during constant bombardment because you said you wouldn't leave wounded soldiers behind. He told me that story 100 times. He said you were the bravest person he ever met." Dr. Harlan, who had been making his morning rounds and had entered the ICU just in time to hear the general's words, stood frozen in the doorway. He looked at Emily with an expression that combined shock, embarrassment, and dawning comprehension. "Commander? You were a commanding officer? In combat operations?" Emily tried to deflect the attention. "That was a long time ago, Dr. Harlan. I left active duty 3 years ago due to injuries. I'm just a civilian surgeon now. My military service isn't relevant to my work here." General Briggs shook his head firmly, despite his weakened condition. "No, Commander. Your service is absolutely relevant. You didn't stop being a leader when you took off the uniform. You proved that 2 days ago when you saved my life after everyone else gave up." The story spread through Arlington Military Hospital like wildfire. Within hours, everyone from senior administrators to maintenance staff knew that the young doctor who had been dismissed as inexperienced and too young was actually a decorated Navy medical officer who had commanded field operations in one of the most dangerous combat zones in recent history. News media picked up the story, and suddenly Emily Carter was being described as a hero, a miracle worker, someone who had saved a 4-star general's life against impossible odds. The Department of Defense scheduled a special recognition ceremony at the Pentagon, and Emily was required to attend despite her reluctance to accept public recognition. The auditorium was filled with military officers, government officials, hospital staff, and journalists. When Emily walked onto the stage wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 3 years, the entire room stood and applauded. On the large screens mounted on the walls, photographs appeared from her deployment in Ramadi, showing a younger Emily in combat fatigues covered in dust and blood, her face exhausted but determined. The Surgeon General of the United States, a 3-star admiral, stepped forward to present the recognition. Dr. Emily Carter distinguished herself not only through exceptional surgical skill, but through the kind of moral courage that defines the very best of military medicine. She didn't just save General Briggs. She reminded all of us what it means to fight for every life, to never accept defeat, and to lead by example rather than by rank. He pinned the Medal of Medical Honor to her uniform, the highest civilian recognition that could be given to a medical professional. Effective immediately, Dr. Carter's commission as Commander in Naval Medical Operations is hereby restored with full honors. Her service record, which was closed due to medical discharge, is being amended to reflect continued exceptional service to the nation. Dr. Harlan approached the stage slowly, his movements showing the weight of his own regrets and misjudgments. When he reached Emily, he rendered a formal military salute, something that looked awkward coming from a civilian doctor, but was clearly heartfelt. "Commander Carter, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on your age and appearance. I dismissed your capabilities without ever taking the time to understand who you really were or what you had accomplished. That was my failure, not yours." Emily returned the salute and then offered her hand for a handshake instead. "Dr. Harlan, you weren't wrong to be cautious. Experience matters in medicine. But I learned something in combat that I think applies to civilian practice too. The real test of a doctor isn't how many years they practiced. It's whether they're willing to fight for their patients when everyone else has given up. That's the only experience that truly matters." The ceremony concluded with General Briggs, who had insisted on attending despite still being in recovery, making his way slowly to the stage with the assistance of a cane. He stood before Emily and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the auditorium to hear. "A general commands thousands of soldiers, but this doctor, this commander, has taught me that the greatest form of leadership is fighting for one life at a time, with everything you have, regardless of what anyone else thinks is possible. If you believe that true honor needs no introduction, comment, "I believe." In the weeks and months following the ceremony at the Pentagon, Arlington Military Hospital underwent a subtle but profound transformation. Emily Carter returned to her regular duties, still arriving early and staying late, still taking on difficult cases that other surgeons preferred to avoid. But the atmosphere around her had changed completely. The same doctors who had mocked her age and dismissed her suggestions now actively sought her input on complicated cases. One afternoon, an older surgeon who had been particularly dismissive during Emily's first weeks at the hospital approached her in the staff lounge. He sat down across from her and spoke with obvious discomfort. "Commander Carter, I need to say something. When you first arrived here, I made jokes about your age. I told other people you were too young and inexperienced to be taken seriously. I was completely wrong, and I'm sorry. More than that, you've reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. I got so focused on procedures and protocols that I forgot the whole point is saving lives, not protecting our own reputations." Emily looked at him with genuine warmth. "Dr. Morrison, you don't need to apologize. Every doctor in this hospital is skilled and dedicated. We all want the same thing. Sometimes we just need to be reminded that taking risks for patients isn't recklessness. It's what we signed up for." She began organizing a new training program called Combat Medical Skills for Civilian Surgeons, designed to teach hospital doctors the kind of improvisation and rapid decision-making techniques that field medics used in combat zones. The program was voluntary, but it quickly became one of the most popular continuing education offerings at the hospital. During the first session, Emily shared stories from her deployments that illustrated the difference between textbook medicine and real-world crisis response. "When I was 23 years old, I was ordered to evacuate a field hospital because enemy forces were closing in. I disobeyed that order and stayed behind to extract 6 wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved safely. If I had followed protocol, those 6 men would have died. But I had to accept that if something went wrong, I would face a court-martial for disobeying orders. That's the kind of decision-making we need in emergency medicine. Sometimes the rule book has to be set aside to do what's right." The training room was completely silent as the assembled doctors absorbed the implications of what she was saying. One young resident raised her hand tentatively. "Commander Carter, how do you know when it's right to break the rules? How do you know you're not just being reckless?" Emily smiled at the question. "You know because you ask yourself one simple question. Am I doing this for the patient, or am I doing this for myself? If the answer is genuinely for the patient, and you've exhausted every conventional option, then sometimes breaking rules is the most ethical choice you can make." General Briggs, who had made a remarkable recovery and returned to limited duty, attended one of the training sessions as a guest speaker. He stood before the group of doctors and spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades in leadership positions. "I've commanded thousands of soldiers in my career. I've made life and death decisions that affected entire military operations. But watching Commander Carter work taught me something I never fully understood before. Real leadership isn't about rank or authority or having people follow your orders. Real leadership is about being willing to stand alone, to take responsibility, and to fight for what matters even when everyone tells you it's impossible." The room erupted in applause, with every doctor standing to acknowledge both the general and the commander who had saved his life. Emily remained seated, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that these moments were important for the people around her, even if they made her personally uncomfortable. If you respect those who save lives in silence, comment respect. 1 year after the surgery that changed everything, Emily Carter received an appointment that surprised her more than any recognition or ceremony had. The Department of Defense asked her to serve as a special consultant for the Global Field Medic Initiative, a program designed to train military medical personnel from allied nations in advanced combat trauma care. It was a position that would allow her to continue practicing medicine while also sharing the knowledge and experience she had gained during her years of service. The announcement ceremony was held at Arlington Military Hospital, in the main auditorium where Emily had first met skepticism and dismissal from the senior medical staff. But now that same auditorium was filled with colleagues who respected her, administrators who valued her contributions, and young doctors who saw her as a role model and inspiration. When she stepped up to the podium to deliver her acceptance speech, she looked out at the crowd and felt a sense of completion that had been missing since she left active duty. When I first came to this hospital, people questioned whether I was old enough or experienced enough to be taken seriously. I understand why they felt that way. In a profession where experience is measured in years and decades, being 29 makes you an outsider. But what I hope we've all learned is that honor and capability aren't determined by how many birthdays you've celebrated. They're determined by what you're willing to do when someone's life depends on you. After the ceremony, Emily walked through the hospital corridors one last time as a regular staff member. She stopped in front of a newly installed memorial wall, the Doctors of Valor display that honored medical professionals who had served in combat zones. Her name had been added to the wall, engraved in brass along with hundreds of others. Commander Emily Carter, saved a general, saved a belief. A young female doctor, fresh out of medical school and just beginning her residency, approached nervously. "Commander Carter, can I ask you something? I'm about to start working here and I'm terrified that nobody will take me seriously because I look young and I'm a woman. Do you have any advice?" Emily turned to face her, remembering her own fears and doubts when she had first arrived at Arlington. "My advice is simple. Don't let anyone measure your worth by the year you were born. Let them measure it by what your heart tells you to do when someone needs you. That's the only metric that matters." She walked outside to the hospital courtyard, where the American flag flew above the main entrance. General Briggs was waiting there, recovered enough to have returned to administrative duties at the Pentagon. He stood beside her in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. "The military needs more commanders like you, Emily. People who lead through action rather than authority." Emily watched the flag moving in the wind and smiled. "The world doesn't need more commanders, General. It needs more people who believe that every life is worth fighting for. Rank has nothing to do with it." The sun set over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the hospital grounds, and Emily Carter stood there knowing that her journey had come full circle. She had left the military thinking her service was over, but she had discovered that true service never really ends. It just finds new forms. If you believe courage has no rank, subscribe to the Veteran's Story. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.